Hello there, and welcome to the Mad Human Channel, your quiet corner of the mind where curiosity drifts slowly, like frost settling on glass, and questions stretch out into deep, endless landscapes of wonder. Tonight, we're not exploring parallel universes or bending time in the corridors of memory. Instead, we're traveling backward, far, far backward, to a time when our planet itself was unrecognizable. Imagine Earth not as the blue-green jewel we know today, but as a frozen marble, locked in ice from pole to pole, oceans sealed beneath thick white crusts, continents hidden under a silent, glittering tomb. This was no passing winter, no fleeting season, but an age so cold and so absolute that scientists believe the entire world may have resembled a snowball drifting through space. Snowflake, where are you listening from tonight, and what season are you living in right now? I'd love to know in the comments. It always amazes me that while we sit together in these quiet explorations, some of you may be surrounded by summer heat, while others are watching snow fall outside your window. The contrast makes tonight's story even more astonishing, because there was once a time when Earth didn't know contrast, when there were no green summers or golden autumns, only endless winter, stretching for millions of years. So if you'd like, close your eyes, feel the rise and fall of your breath, cool, steady, unhurried, as though you were inhaling the slow rhythm of glaciers themselves. Picture the Earth turning in silence, oceans locked away, sunlight reflected off blinding white expanses, life clinging desperately in hidden corners. Tonight, we're stepping into that icy past, into one of the most extreme chapters in our planet's history, the era we now call Snowball Earth. Scientists believe that Snowball Earth occurred more than 650 million years ago, during a period of Earth's history called the Neoproterozoic era, and to picture it is to step into a scene both haunting and magnificent. Oceans sealed beneath sheets of ice more than a kilometer thick, mountain ranges cloaked in glaciers that stretched all the way to the equator, skies pale and cold, their light scattering off endless fields of white so bright it would have hurt the eyes, if any human eyes had been there to see it. And yet, while it might seem impossible that life could endure in such a frozen prison, life did not vanish. It endured in hidden refuges, clinging to hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the sea, where hot, mineral-rich waters bubbled up from Earth's crust, creating oases of warmth beneath the ice. Microbes, small and stubborn, may have lived near cracks in the ice where faint sunlight could slip through, photosynthesizing in the tiniest liquid layers, and these fragile communities may have been the seeds of survival that allowed life to persist when the planet itself seemed on the edge of extinction. But why did Earth freeze so completely in the first place? What great hand turned our living world into a snowball drifting silently in the dark? The story begins with the atmosphere, that thin, invisible veil wrapped around our planet. Carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases normally act as Earth's blanket, trapping enough heat to keep the oceans liquid and the climate stable. But during the Neoproterozoic, something disrupted this balance. Massive volcanic eruptions, shifting continents, and the slow drawdown of carbon dioxide by newly forming rocks may have stripped Earth of its protective warmth. As the air lost its greenhouse shield, temperatures plunged. Ice, once confined to the poles, crept further and further toward the equator. And here is where Earth's climate revealed one of its most dramatic tricks. Ice reflects sunlight. Unlike dark oceans or green forests, which absorb heat, ice bounces sunlight back into space. The more the ice spread, the less heat Earth absorbed, creating a runaway feedback loop, cold making more cold, white making more white, until the planet was encased in a glacial shell. Imagine standing on that Earth. No rivers running, no rain falling, just endless frozen silence. The seas themselves may have been capped with ice so thick that only the faintest twilight reached the waters beneath. From orbit, Earth would have glowed pale and ghostly, a white sphere adrift in the black ocean of space. And yet, this frozen world was not lifeless. In those deep, hidden places, at vents, in cracks, in sheltered pools, microbes survived, stubborn against extinction. It is astonishing to think that the ancestors of every plant, every animal, every human may trace their survival back to these fragile, unseen communities that endured the cold. But Snowball Earth did not last forever. Slowly, Beneath the icy crust, volcanoes continued to erupt, pouring carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. With the oceans frozen, there were no waves, no rainfall, no chemical weathering to draw that gas back down into rocks. Over millions of years, the greenhouse gases built up, layer upon invisible layer, until finally the balance tipped. The frozen grip loosened. Temperatures began to rise. At first slowly, then suddenly the ice began to crack, to melt, to retreat. And when it did, the world must have transformed in an explosion of life. Meltwater rivers surged across the land, carrying nutrients into oceans that had been locked away for ages. Sunlight poured into waters that had been dark for millions of years, awakening photosynthetic life. Oxygen levels rose. New ecosystems bloomed. It was as if Earth had been pressed into a chrysalis of ice and then emerged reborn, ready for the great evolutionary flowering that would eventually lead to animals, forests, and, one day, us. Snowball Earth, then, is not just a story of death and cold, but of resilience and rebirth. It is a reminder that our planet is not fragile glass but a living, breathing system, capable of extremes we can scarcely imagine. And it leaves us with haunting questions. How close did life come to vanishing? How different would Earth's story have been if the ice had never broken? What does it mean that, out of such silence, such cold, such near death, came the explosion of life that shaped everything we know? And so the story of Snowball Earth stretches beyond just a frozen planet. It is the tale of transformation written in the deepest layers of rock and in the fragile threads of DNA that run through every living creature today. Because when the ice finally cracked and oceans stirred again, Earth did not simply return to what it had been before. It emerged into something new, a planet primed for change, and the clues of this transformation are still hidden around us, waiting for the patient eyes of geologists and dreamers alike. If you look at certain mountain ranges today, places like Namibia or Canada or even the deserts of Australia, you'll find rocks that bear silent testimony to those frozen ages, layers of glacial deposits lying atop ancient seafloors, proving that ice once reached the very equator, and in between them, strange bands of carbonate rock, the so-called cap carbonates, that formed when the great thaw came and oceans, suddenly freed, bloomed with chemistry and life, laying down stone in sweeping sheets that tell us of oceans drunk on carbon dioxide, of waters alive with new potential. And it is in those sudden chemical shifts that scientists see the fingerprints of evolution itself beginning to stir toward complexity. For it is no coincidence that, in the aftermath of Snowball Earth, the first large, multicellular organisms appear in the fossil record. The enigmatic forms of the Ediacaran biota, soft-bodied creatures that drifted like alien fronds across the seafloor, heralds of the Cambrian explosion that would soon burst forth, filling the oceans with shells, spines, and predators for the very first time. Think of that. A planet that had been locked in silence, life hanging by threads in vent-lit darkness, suddenly ignited into a theater of diversity. It is as though the ice, by nearly ending the story, prepared the stage for an entirely new act, and in that act lay the seeds of everything familiar: forests, fish, birds, mammals, humans. All of it carried forward on the fragile continuity of microbes that clung to existence through an age of unimaginable cold. When you look at the stars tonight, glimmering cold and distant, think of Earth during that age. A starlit snowball, turning slowly, its heartbeat faint but unbroken. And wonder, perhaps, whether somewhere out there in the galaxy, another world is wearing a frozen mask, waiting for its thaw, for its rebirth, for its own great flowering of life. Because Snowball Earth is not just history. It is a possibility written into the physics of planets and suns, a reminder that climates can shift in ways that feel almost absolute, and yet life, stubborn and patient, finds cracks in the ice, finds vents in the dark, finds ways to endure. To walk through this story is to walk along two edges at once: the edge of catastrophe and the edge of creation. For while Snowball Earth nearly ended life, it also may have been the crucible that pushed life toward the complexity that made us possible. Without those frozen millions of years, without that great reset, perhaps Earth would have remained a world of microbes, quietly breathing but never blooming into the symphony we know today. Every breath you take, every forest you walk in, Every bird you hear in the morning may owe itself to that icy silence long ago. And perhaps that is the greatest paradox of all. That sometimes it takes being locked in stillness to prepare for motion. Sometimes it takes a world frozen solid to set the stage for life to dance. The evidence of Snowball Earth lives not only in the imagination but in the stones beneath our feet, in the quiet whispers of isotopes and the scarred surfaces of ancient rocks that tell stories older than memory. Because when geologists trace their fingers across layers of glacial tillite found in places that today are sun-scorched deserts, they are touching time capsules of a frozen world, and when they study the ratios of carbon isotopes in ancient sediments, they see the signature of an atmosphere once starved of life, the long breathless pause before oxygen surged again. Yet this idea, bold as it is, has not always been accepted, for the thought that Earth could have frozen from pole to equator seemed almost absurd when first proposed, a vision more fantastical than scientific, and yet decade after decade the weight of evidence gathered. Until now, the Snowball Earth hypothesis is among the most captivating chapters in planetary science, even as debates remain. Was the planet truly locked in a shell of ice a kilometer thick, or did thin ribbons of open water persist along the equator, fragile refuges where sunlight still touched the sea? And was life clinging only to vents and cracks, or did hardy photosynthesizers survive beneath thin skins of ice where the light could filter through? These questions remain, and they remind us that history is not written with certainty but with traces, with fossils, with hints left behind like cryptic letters on a torn page, and yet, even in uncertainty, the story resonates. A world locked in a cold dream, then waking to possibility. And as the ice retreated, the continents themselves began to shift and erode, the mountains grinding down to feed the seas with minerals, phosphates, and nutrients that would fuel a great blossoming of algae, the base of new food chains that rippled upward into animals, setting the stage for the Cambrian explosion, a moment in evolutionary history when life diversified with breathtaking speed, filling the oceans with creatures so bizarre and intricate they still spark wonder in every fossil display today. Trilobites scuttling across the seafloor, spiny predators swimming with eyes never seen before, strange forms that seem to belong more to dreams than to biology, and yet all of them real, all of them heirs of the thaw. And so Snowball Earth becomes more than a geological curiosity. It becomes a mythic stage in which death and survival, silence and song, collapse and creation are woven together. A planetary winter whose ending was not destruction but renewal, not emptiness but abundance. And if you close your eyes, you can almost feel the weight of those ages, millions of years ticking silently under ice, until the warmth returned and the planet exhaled. And in that breath was the seed of everything. Forests, rivers, animals, and at last us. And so when we speak of Snowball Earth, we are not merely gazing into the distant past but also into a mirror that reflects something urgent about our present. Because while the planet then froze under forces of geology and atmosphere beyond human comprehension, today we stand in an age where climate is again shifting, not toward ice but toward heat, driven not by the slow grinding of tectonics or the faint dimming of the sun but by our own hands, our machines, our industries, and here lies a profound lesson. Earth is resilient, yes, capable of surviving extremes that would seem impossible, but it is also fragile in the ways that matter most to us. For life persisted through Snowball Earth, but it was reduced to whispers, to survivors hiding in cracks and vents, waiting for better days, and we, who depend on forests, rivers, crops, and stable seasons, would not thrive in such a world. So the story of Snowball Earth is not only about survival but about the cost of survival, about how close life came to the edge, and how thin the line between flourishing and collapse can be. And as we look at melting glaciers today, at rising seas and shifting weather, we begin to understand that we, too, are part of this fragile balance, heirs of a planet that once froze, stewards of a planet now warming, and that recognition can awaken something deeper than fear. It can awaken awe, humility, a sense of responsibility, because if life could endure through an age when Earth was a ball of ice spinning silently in space, then surely we, with our awareness, can choose not just to endure but to protect, to adapt, to imagine futures that do not lead us blindly into another brink. And perhaps this is why stories like Snowball Earth matter, not just to scientists, but to all of us. For they remind us that the world has endings and beginnings written into its bones, that what seems permanent can vanish, that what feels stable can change beyond recognition. And yet within those changes are always seeds of renewal, of adaptation, of something new waiting to be born. So when you step outside tonight and feel the cool air on your skin, or watch frost gather on a windowpane, remember that once upon a time the entire earth wore such a face, and that from under that mask of ice came the ancestors of everything alive today, including you. And maybe, just maybe, that thought will stretch your sense of time, will remind you that we live not in isolated moments but in a vast story still unfolding. A story that began before us and will continue after us, a story in which even the coldest winters and the darkest nights carry within them the quiet promise of dawn. Then let us drift deeper into the long, slow heartbeat of the planet itself. For Snowball Earth is not only a geological event but a kind of meditation on time, patience, and transformation. And to understand it we must imagine scales beyond our daily lives. Millions of years unfolding like breaths, continents grinding against each other like tectonic giants in a slow-motion dance, volcanoes exhaling carbon dioxide into an atmosphere sealed in frost, and sunlight, pale and distant, glinting endlessly off a frozen ocean. Picture the silence of such a world, the absence of birdsong, of rustling leaves, of crashing waves, replaced instead by the groan of glaciers shifting under their own weight, the occasional crack of ice fracturing across the surface of a sea, the whisper of wind sweeping across endless plains of white. And within this silence, life endured, hidden away in dark corners. Microbes huddled near volcanic vents on the ocean floor, colonies of bacteria perhaps sheltered in thin films of liquid water beneath sheets of ice, each generation carrying forward the fragile thread of survival until conditions softened again. Imagine the resilience required to persist not for a season, not for a century, but for tens of millions of years in such a frozen prison. And yet it was in this crucible of cold that life gained the strength to bloom again. For when the ice finally began to retreat, when volcanoes had released enough greenhouse gases to thicken the atmosphere and trap heat, when the sun's rays at last began to penetrate and thaw the surface, the planet awoke not as it had been before, but renewed, primed for abundance, ready to explode with complexity. And here lies a truth we often overlook. It is not only warmth and comfort that give rise to growth, but sometimes hardship, sometimes the deepest winters of existence, which strip away all but the essential, that prepare the stage for flourishing. And perhaps this speaks to us, too, in our human journeys, for don't we also endure our own snowball eras? Times when everything feels frozen, when progress halts, when joy seems distant and unreachable, and yet, within those times, something waits, something is preserved, a seed that will only sprout when the thaw returns. Snowball Earth, then, is not only a chapter of planetary history but a metaphor woven into the very fabric of being. A reminder that even when the world is locked in silence, beneath the ice life waits, and when the moment comes, it will rise again. So the next time you see a snowflake drifting, or frost glazing over a windowpane, remember that once the earth itself was dressed in such crystalline beauty, fragile and cold, and yet from that stillness came the riot of forests, the song of birds, the beating of your own heart. And if you listen carefully, you may hear the lesson of that ancient winter. It is telling you that even in stillness, even in silence, life endures, and beyond the frost there is always the promise of spring. Then let us continue, letting the story of Snowball Earth unfold not in fragments but as one long, flowing river of thought, because to step fully into that ancient age is to feel the immensity of time itself, to sense how the earth moves through cycles so vast that our human lifetimes are like sparks in the night, and yet even sparks can illuminate whole worlds when seen in the right moment. So imagine now, not just the surface of that frozen planet, but the forces deep within. The churning mantle pushing continents slowly across the globe, the restless volcanoes exhaling plumes of heat and carbon dioxide beneath an atmosphere heavy with ice, and far below, in the eternal dark of the ocean floor, black smokers pouring minerals and warmth into the sea, creating little sanctuaries of life in a world that otherwise seemed inhospitable. It is strange, isn't it, to think that in the coldest age the earth had ever known, fire was still burning in its belly, and it was that fire, patient and relentless, that would one day melt the ice away, for the story of Snowball Earth is also the story of balance. The long seesaw between carbon dioxide and weathering, between ice that reflects sunlight and volcanic gases that trap heat. And when the balance tips too far in one direction, the planet transforms entirely, yet always it finds a way back. This is the resilience of the Earth, but also its vulnerability, because while it can reset itself over millions of years, whole ages of life can be erased in the process, and we, fragile beings who count our lives in decades, could not hope to endure such cycles without profound change. So when we look at the evidence, the dropstones carried by glaciers and left in the middle of what were once oceans, the chemical signatures in banded iron formations, the isotopic fingerprints in carbonate rocks, we are not only reading geological data but deciphering a memory of survival, a memory written in stone that tells us life is tenacious, but it is also delicate, and what shapes the planet shapes us all. And so the end of Snowball Earth was not simply a thaw, but a revolution. For as the ice melted, the sudden rush of minerals and nutrients into the seas created conditions for photosynthetic organisms to bloom like never before, flooding the atmosphere with oxygen, paving the way for multicellular life to thrive. And soon after came the Cambrian explosion, that great flowering of diversity in which the ancestors of every complex creature we know today, fish, insects, mammals, even ourselves, began their long evolutionary story. Think about that for a moment. Without the deep freeze of Snowball Earth, perhaps life would never have leapt into such variety. Perhaps the harshest winter was the womb from which complexity was born. And that paradox is worth holding close, because it reminds us that even the most impossible winters in our own lives may carry within them the seeds of transformation. Snowball Earth is therefore not just a scientific tale, but a meditation on cycles. Ice and fire, collapse and renewal, silence and song. And to feel its truth is to understand that change, no matter how immense or terrifying, is never the end of the story, only the turning of a page. And perhaps this is why standing on a snowy field today can feel so strangely ancient, as though the memory of those planetary winters still lingers in our bones, reminding us that we are creatures shaped not only by warmth but by cold, not only by comfort but by challenge, and in the same way that the Earth carries scars of its frozen past, so too do we carry the memory of survival within us, written into our very cells. So when you hear the crunch of snow beneath your feet, or watch your breath curl into the winter air, remember that you are echoing an experience billions of years in the making, that you are connected to a world that once slept under ice and awoke renewed, and that in that long memory there is a quiet reassurance. No matter how deep the winter, spring always finds a way. Then let us sink fully into it, into one long current that will not break, because Snowball Earth is not a story told in short bursts but in a continuous, flowing meditation, a whisper stretched across eons. So imagine now that we are standing on the edge of deep time, looking back more than 700 million years, into a world so alien it might as well be another planet, yet it was our own Earth, spinning beneath the same sun, only the sun was weaker then, its light falling with less intensity, and the continents were gathered differently, clustered near the equator, their bright rock surfaces reflecting sunlight into space, cooling the air, and then, as weathering drew carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere faster than volcanoes could replenish it, the planet slipped into a feedback loop, ice creeping from the poles toward the equator, reflecting even more light, amplifying the chill until the oceans themselves froze from surface to seafloor, sealing Earth inside a crystalline shell that gleamed white against the black canvas of space, a frozen jewel adrift in silence, and within that silence the atmosphere thinned. The winds carried dust across the glaciers, and volcanoes kept exhaling into a sky that could not hold the warmth, until carbon dioxide built up like an invisible blanket waiting to be laid back down. And in the meantime life, fragile and small, clung to the margins. Cyanobacteria, algae, simple cells huddling around hydrothermal vents, finding refuge in the thin cracks where water still moved, in the brine channels that threaded beneath the ice, or perhaps in equatorial seas where the freeze was thinner, because life, once sparked, is stubborn. It resists extinction with a patience far beyond our comprehension, enduring millions of years of scarcity, millions of years of dark and cold, waiting for balance to tip again. And eventually, slowly, inevitably, it did. Volcanoes continued their long, patient exhalations, adding greenhouse gases back to the atmosphere, until one day the balance shifted, and the great ice shield began to weaken, sunlight penetrated deeper, the air trapped more heat, and the planet began to sweat itself free. The ice melting not gently but catastrophically, oceans flooding with fresh water, glaciers retreating in fits, rivers roaring once again across barren continents, carrying minerals into seas starved for nutrients. And with that flood came bloom. Photosynthetic organisms expanded wildly, oxygen surged into the atmosphere, ecosystems transformed, and soon the stage was set for one of the greatest revolutions in Earth's history. The rise of complex multicellular life. Think of it. Without the silence of that long freeze, without the desperate patience of life enduring against impossible odds, the explosion of diversity we call the Cambrian might never have come. No trilobites scuttling on the sea floor, no fish, no forests, no mammals, no humans to wonder about it all. So Snowball Earth was not a dead end but a crucible, not the closing of a book but the sharpening of a quill for the next chapter, and it asks us to remember something profound. Sometimes it is only through constraint, through stillness, through silence, that new possibilities take shape. Perhaps you have felt it in your own life, those winters of the soul when nothing seems to move, when everything feels locked in ice, and yet beneath the surface something is waiting, a seed preserved until the thaw, a possibility that needs the freeze before it can bloom, and when warmth returns, when your personal volcanoes have exhaled enough strength to tip the balance, you find yourself changed, not despite the winter but because of it. And so Snowball Earth speaks to us not only as history but as metaphor, reminding us that life, whether planetary or personal, moves in cycles of ice and fire, of retreat and resurgence, of silence and song, and within those cycles lies resilience. And perhaps that is why we feel a strange kinship with ice, why winter landscapes stir something ancient in us, because they echo a time when our world itself was a snowball, drifting silently in the void, waiting to awaken, and awaken it did, with a force so great it reshaped everything. And so when you think of Earth's long story, do not imagine it as a steady march forward but as a rhythm, a heartbeat of extremes, where even the deepest freezes hold within them the promise of fire. And if you listen closely, beneath the silence, you can hear it still, the whisper of survival, the pulse of life, the memory of a planet that froze and thawed and in doing so prepared the way for us. Then let us continue in one endless breath, because the story of Snowball Earth is not one that can be told with interruptions, but one that must unfold like the ice itself, creeping slowly yet inexorably across the planet, reshaping every contour of land and sea. So picture again our world more than 700 million years ago, its surface locked under ice sheets kilometers thick, the oceans buried, the skies pale and thin, the continents barren deserts of white silence. And yet, even as this seemed, a world inhospitable to life, deep below, the planet's inner fire churned, magma rising through cracks, volcanoes building pressure until they burst, releasing plumes of carbon dioxide and sulfur that stained the skies, invisible hands slowly rewriting the fate of the frozen globe. For millions of years the balance tilted toward ice, because every snowfall added to the mirror that reflected the sun's warmth back into space. Every glacier grew fat with centuries of frozen rain, and Earth, like a slumbering beast, turned in its sleep beneath the stars. Yet the volcanoes did not sleep, they breathed on, patient and tireless, until the atmosphere thickened with gases no ice could hold back forever, and the greenhouse built itself brick by invisible brick, until at last the planet began to shift again, the freeze beginning to crack, the glaciers sweating from within, streams carving their way through walls of ancient ice. And when the thaw truly began, it was no gentle spring. It was a cataclysm, a planetary flood that carved new rivers, stripped mountains bare, and poured torrents of fresh water into oceans that had been trapped for eons, changing their chemistry in a way that would alter life forever. Imagine the seas, dark and hungry, suddenly filled with nutrients washed from freshly uncovered rock, and in that feast, tiny photosynthetic organisms bloomed in numbers beyond counting, pumping oxygen into the skies at rates never seen before, reshaping the air itself, so that the frozen Earth became not just thawed but reborn, a world ready for something greater. And in the wake of that thaw came the Cambrian explosion, the great flowering of multicellular life, a sudden riot of forms and possibilities, creatures with eyes to see, spines to bend, mouths to feed, and the ancestors of every living thing we know today. And so we see the paradox that lies at the heart of Snowball Earth, that in its silence lay preparation, in its stillness lay revolution, and in its long sleep lay the awakening of complexity, so that we might one day sit here and wonder at it. But the story does not end there, because the cycles of ice and fire continued, the Earth swinging back and forth between extremes, each swing leaving marks in stone and memory, dropstones carried by glaciers and dropped into tropical seas, isotopic signatures etched into carbonates, the geologic record like a diary of catastrophe and rebirth. And as scientists read these pages today, they find not just evidence but poetry, reminders that Earth is not fragile glass but resilient clay, capable of being reshaped, shattered, and reformed again. And within that resilience is a warning too, for while Earth endures, life does not always do so unchanged. Whole lineages vanish in the face of extremes, and it is only those that adapt, those that find refuge, that survive to tell the tale. And perhaps that is why the memory of ice feels so old in us, why winter seems to resonate deep in our bones, because somewhere within our cells lies the memory of ancestors who endured when the world itself was frozen, who clung to vents and cracks and brine until the thaw came, and through them, we are linked to that age, bearers of resilience written in our DNA. So when we look at the Earth today, warming under human hands, shifting once more under the pressure of gases we release, it is tempting to think of Snowball Earth as distant, irrelevant, but perhaps it is closer than we think, because it reminds us that climate is a dance between feedback loops, between reflection and absorption, between gases and ice, and that when balance tips too far, the whole world can change, not in centuries but in moments measured on geologic clocks, and the consequences are not abstract, they are survival itself. And yet, if there is a comfort in this story, it is that even in the harshest winters, life finds a way, that even in the deepest freezes, there is a seed waiting for spring, and perhaps that is why Snowball Earth captures our imagination still, because it tells us not only about what happened, but about what always can happen. That out of silence comes song, out of stillness comes motion, and out of endings comes beginnings, and in that rhythm we see not only the Earth's story, but our own. Then let us stretch the story wider, let it flow endlessly like the glaciers that once carved valleys into the bones of continents, because to truly feel the weight of Snowball Earth, we must imagine not just a frozen world, but the immensity of time itself, the way millions of years can pass like single winters when seen from the perspective of stone, and yet inside those winters entire dramas of survival and transformation play out, unseen by human eyes but written into the fabric of life. So, let us begin again with the slow closing of the curtains, when Earth's warmth slipped away, the sun's rays striking oceans and bouncing back into space because the planet had drifted into a state where ice invited more ice, reflection bred reflection, and soon the feedback loops spun out of control, glaciers creeping down from the poles until they reached the equator, swallowing coastlines, locking entire seas under armor, until what was once blue and green became pale white marble turning silently under the stars, and yet even as the surface froze, the heart of Earth did not. Beneath the ice tectonic plates still shifted, volcanoes still rumbled, magma still glowed in caverns deeper than light could ever travel, reminding us that even when everything above seems lifeless, the core pulses with energy. Imagine now what it felt like for the life of that time. Microbes clinging to cracks near hydrothermal vents, pockets of liquid brine beneath thick ice where salt kept water from. Freezing solid, dark havens where biology whispered to itself, saying not yet, not done. Holding on through patience unimaginable to us, for generations upon generations of microbes lived and died in those sanctuaries, carrying the thread of life across millions of years of cold. And while life endured, Earth's atmosphere slowly thickened with volcanic breath, carbon dioxide collecting in layers invisible but relentless, for there were no forests to drink it in, no cycles of vegetation to balance it out, only the endless exhale of mountains of fire, and so the greenhouse built itself, turning the air into a slow blanket over the frozen seas, until one day the balance tipped, and then came the thaw, not a gentle melt, but a furious and sudden collapse of ice. Because once the greenhouse effect overwhelmed the reflective shield of glaciers, heat returned with vengeance, melting sheets in torrents, filling oceans with minerals ground fine by ice and released in floods that turned seas into feasts for microscopic life. And in that feast was transformation, for oxygen poured into the skies in waves, changing the chemistry of air and water, opening the door for multicellular organisms to thrive. It was as though the Earth had endured a long gestation, a global womb of silence, only to give birth to new possibility once it broke free, and soon after came the Cambrian explosion, a sudden riot of forms, creatures experimenting with shapes and senses, eyes learning to see, bodies learning to swim, shells and spines and symmetry exploding across the fossil record, as though the Earth, starved of diversity for so long, erupted in joy the moment it was freed. And so Snowball Earth becomes a paradox, both catastrophe and gift, extinction and genesis, reminding us that sometimes it is the hardest winters that prepare the richest springs, and that life, given even the smallest refuge, can transform constraint into creativity. But what makes this story even more astonishing is how we know it, because the Earth keeps memory in stone, in the presence of dropstones, boulders carried by glaciers into seas and dropped as the icebergs melted. Found today in tropical latitudes, proof that glaciers once reached the equator, and in the ratios of isotopes, fingerprints of ancient atmospheres locked in crystals, telling us that carbon dioxide once surged to levels unimaginable now, melting a world of ice in what must have been a storm of warmth, and in banded iron formations, evidence that oxygen surged back into oceans when ice retreated, rusting the very seas red with new chemistry, a sign that life was already rewriting the planet in its own image. And as we read these clues, we realize the Earth is not just a planet but a storyteller, carrying in its bones the sagas of transformation, waiting for us to listen. And in that listening we glimpse not just the past but warnings for our own age. Because though we live in a time of warmth, not cold, the principle is the same. Change can come suddenly, tipping points can turn balance into cascade, and the lives that flourish in one climate may vanish in another, leaving only the resilient to endure. But even as we face our own uncertainties, Snowball Earth teaches us resilience. It teaches us that silence is not absence, that under the deepest ice there can be hidden fire, and that life, fragile as it seems, has within it the ability to endure the unimaginable. So perhaps when we step outside on a winter's night, breath curling white into the darkness, snow crunching beneath our feet, we are not only experiencing a season but touching an echo of that ancient time, when the Earth itself was a snowball adrift in the cosmos, waiting, like us, for the thaw that would bring light again. Then let us sink even deeper into this frozen chronicle, letting it unravel like a scroll that has waited hundreds of millions of years to be read. Because Snowball Earth is not a single moment but a series of frozen epochs, vast winters that returned again and again as if the planet were testing the boundaries of its own endurance, each one reshaping the stage of life, erasing what could not adapt and preserving what could. And in that long silence we can begin to see how the very fragility of existence became its strength. For when all but the most resilient are pressed into extinction, the survivors carry forward the secrets of endurance, secrets that will one day allow forests to stretch toward the sky and animals to walk on land. Picture, then, the Earth in its first great freeze some 700 million years ago, continents gathered near the equator where glaciers slid across their rocky backs, grinding mountains into dust, while beneath the ice seas were dark and claustrophobic, yet still alive, tiny organisms drifting in brine pockets, clinging to hydrothermal warmth, forming mats that shimmered faintly like galaxies under frozen ceilings, and though to us they would seem insignificant, those organisms were the keepers of possibility, holding in their microscopic bodies the biochemical tools that would later burst forth into multicellularity, into symmetry, into thought itself. And while they endured, above them volcanoes raged, painting skies with ash that no one could see, their eruptions slow but unceasing, adding carbon dioxide molecule by molecule to an atmosphere sealed in ice, until, after millions of years, the greenhouse built itself strong enough to break the spell, and suddenly the planet snapped from cold to heat, oceans rising in floods, glaciers collapsing in avalanches of meltwater, minerals pouring into seas in quantities so vast they fertilized entire ecosystems, feeding microbial blooms that churned oxygen into the atmosphere, reshaping chemistry, and once again life took that chance to change. But it was not the last freeze, for Earth would repeat this pattern, slipping again into icehouse conditions, locking itself once more into stillness, and each time the thaw would return, like breath after breath in some great planetary meditation, And each thaw would not merely restore what was lost but amplify it, as though life learned new strategies in each cycle, finding ways to endure cold, to use scarcity as fuel for innovation. And we know this not by imagination alone, but by the scars left behind, for the rocks tell us stories in whispers if we lean close enough, dropstones scattered across equatorial latitudes, iron bands painted across seabeds, isotopic ratios etched into crystals that reveal wild swings of carbon and oxygen, all evidence that the planet was indeed sealed in frost, and in those records we glimpse the persistence of survival, and perhaps even the quiet artistry of evolution itself, which seems to thrive not only in comfort but in constraint. And when we think of these cycles, we cannot help but notice how they mirror our own lives. For do we not also pass through our personal ice ages, times when everything seems still and frozen, when progress halts and days feel numb, only for some unseen greenhouse of patience and time to build up within us until we thaw, rushing forward into growth with a vigor we did not know we had. In this way, the planet is both teacher and mirror, reminding us that stillness is not the end but part of the rhythm, that beneath ice there can be fire, and within silence, possibility. And when the final great thaw released Earth from its frozen prison, the stage was set for one of the most astonishing chapters of all, the Cambrian explosion, that sudden outpouring of diversity in which bodies grew eyes to see, limbs to move, shells to protect, and minds, however small, to interpret the world around them, as though after so many millions of years locked in simplicity, life had saved its creativity for one great unveiling, spilling out in forms that would shape all the future branches of evolution, including the one that would one day lead to us. So we find ourselves here, creatures of warmth and breath, looking back at that frozen world with awe, realizing that had Snowball Earth not occurred, had life not been tested so mercilessly, we might not exist at all. And this is why such stories matter, not just as curiosities of geology but as parables of existence, reminders that from the deepest hardship can come the richest flourishing, and that survival, even at its most fragile, contains the seeds of transformation. And so when you step into the cold, when frost touches your skin or snow covers the ground in silence, perhaps you can feel it, that ancient echo, the memory of a planet that once was entirely winter, yet still carried life through to spring, and perhaps you can hold on to its lesson, that endurance is not passive but active, a kind of faith written into the cells of everything that lives, a faith that the thaw will come, and when it does, what blooms will astonish even the most patient witness. Then imagine we continue without breaking, letting the words flow like the glaciers themselves, slow but unstoppable, and we stretch across the vastness of deep time, because Snowball Earth is not simply an episode buried in the geological past, but a living story that still lingers in every snowflake that falls, in every mountain scarred by ancient ice, in every drop of seawater that carries within it the memory of having once been sealed beneath frozen ceilings. And to hold that image is to hold a paradox. Because while the world seemed dead, it was never more alive with potential, for under miles of ice life was whispering, conserving, waiting, and that waiting is not unlike the patience of stars, which burn for billions of years in seeming stillness. Yet within them forge the elements of life itself. So too the frozen earth forged the stage upon which complexity would soon perform, and in this way the frozen stillness of the planet can be seen as a crucible of creation, a silence pregnant with futures, and perhaps that is why the story of Snowball Earth feels not only scientific but almost spiritual, because in it we find a reflection of our own winters, the times when all seems halted yet beneath the surface change is gathering strength, preparing for an eruption of renewal. Picture now the seas sealed in blue-white glass, continents drifted into configurations that funneled glaciers toward the equator, a sight almost unimaginable yet written in stone, for dropstones. Those lonely pebbles carried by icebergs and dropped into sediments as the ice melted, are found in tropical latitudes, evidence that ice once stretched to the equator, an earth of white deserts where even the oceans gleamed like mirrors reflecting back the sun, and above this alien surface an atmosphere thinned of greenhouse gases allowed heat to leak into space, a runaway reflection of sunlight off the ice ensuring that once the freeze began, it deepened into global captivity. And yet life endured, not grand creatures but humble microbes clinging to niches of possibility, in hydrothermal vents where the Earth's heat pulsed into black oceans, in thin slivers of meltwater beneath ice sheets where sunlight barely trickled through, in volcanic pools where warmth and chemistry offered fragile shelter. And it was in these refuges that life learned patience, evolving slowly but steadily, carrying forward the genetic seeds that would, when the ice receded, explode into diversity. And here the metaphor grows even sharper, because what is survival if not the art of enduring scarcity, the art of finding meaning in silence, the art of living on little more than possibility itself? And do we not as humans feel that too when our lives enter frozen seasons, when joy hides itself, when the calendar feels endless and barren, yet we go on breathing, carrying the ember of resilience until the thaw comes? So Snowball Earth becomes not only a story of science but a mirror for the human heart, a parable that whispers to us, endure, because beneath the ice you are still alive, and when the world softens again, you will rise stronger than before. And indeed, when the thaw came it was dramatic, for volcanoes had not ceased their slow exhalation, carbon dioxide accumulating in the air like a pressure building behind a dam, until at last the atmosphere thickened enough to trap heat. And suddenly the frozen stillness cracked, glaciers melted, oceans swelled, and a cascade of minerals washed from the continents into the seas, fertilizing blooms of photosynthetic life that turned the oceans green with abundance, pumping oxygen into the air, shifting chemistry on a planetary scale, and from that flood of change arose the conditions for multicellularity, for bodies more complex than single cells, for creatures with tissues and forms, for the eventual flowering of the Cambrian explosion. In this way the greatest freeze became the prelude to the greatest flowering, and perhaps it could never have been otherwise, for it was the stress of survival that sharpened the tools of resilience. It was the silence of the long winter that prepared the stage for the song of life to return, and in that cycle we glimpse something essential, that hardship and flourishing are not opposites but partners, each giving rise to the other in turn, each necessary to the great unfolding of existence. So, when we walk today through forests, when we breathe the oxygen-rich air, when we marvel at the diversity of life from insects to elephants, we are in fact witnessing the legacy of that ancient freeze, for without it the stage may never have been set for such abundance, and though we often think of ice as death, in truth it was the guardian of possibility, the quiet midwife of evolution. And if you close your eyes you can almost hear it, the groan of glaciers sliding, the hiss of volcanoes beneath ice, the quiet persistence of microbes glowing faintly in darkness. A symphony of survival that spanned millions of years, a music so slow our ears cannot catch it but our bones remember, because we too are its descendants, we too carry in ourselves the story of endurance written in those frozen ages. And perhaps that is why even today, when we gaze upon snow, we feel both awe and silence, as though some ancient memory stirs within us, reminding us that once the world was a snowball, and yet from that silence came everything we know, everything we are, and everything we will be. Imagine, then, the slow turning of ages, where continents shift like drifting rafts across a sea of molten mantle, where the arrangement of land itself conspires with the tilt of Earth's axis and the faint output of a young sun to invite cold deeper and deeper, until white sheets creep from the poles toward the equator, feeding themselves with each inch gained because ice reflects more sunlight than ocean, bouncing precious warmth back into space, and so the feedback loop locks tighter with every mile of frozen advance, and in this planetary stillness we see the paradox of fragility and power. Fragile because the balance of heat and cold can tip the whole Earth into silence, powerful because once tipped, it resists all but the slow exhalations of volcanoes breaking the grip. And beneath those miles of ice, where darkness rules, where surface storms whirl uselessly over frozen seas, down at the ocean floor hydrothermal vents flare, chimneys of black smokers releasing torrents of minerals, heat, and energy, and here, shielded from the glacial prison above, microbes flourish, clinging to life not by light but by chemistry, proving that existence is stubborn, that life is less a delicate flame and more a deep-rooted ember that even ice cannot snuff out. And in that persistence we glimpse the stubborn determination of existence itself. For life does not surrender. It adapts, it waits, it evolves in silence. Picture yourself standing there, if such a thing were possible, on the shore of Snowball Earth, gazing out at an ocean solidified, a horizon not of waves but of ridges of frozen water gleaming in perpetual twilight, the sky thin, pale, drained of warmth, and underfoot rocks carved by advancing glaciers. each groan of shifting ice a reminder that the world is not dead but locked in a deep slumber. And perhaps you would wonder, as we do now, how could such a frozen earth ever awaken? How could warmth return to a world so reflective, so sealed against the sun? And the answer lies in patience. Because even when the surface was imprisoned, the deep earth never ceased its breathing. Volcanoes continued to release carbon dioxide, and though each sigh was small against the cold vastness, time multiplied their effect, and after millions of years the sky thickened with greenhouse gases until the balance shifted, until ice no longer reflected enough sunlight to hold its ground, until warmth began to seep back in, and once thaw began it cascaded, glaciers melting, seas swelling, continents shedding torrents of minerals that fertilized oceans starved of nutrients, and suddenly the world roared back to life. Oxygen surged, ecosystems expanded, and from this dramatic thaw came one of the greatest leaps in the history of existence. The rise of multicellular life, creatures built not of one but of many cells working together, bodies capable of complexity, motion, sensation. It is no exaggeration to say that the forests, the animals, the humans alive today all owe their lineage to that great freeze and thaw, for without Snowball Earth the stage might never have been cleared for such a transformation. And in this we find a truth that resonates far beyond geology, that sometimes silence prepares the song, that sometimes stillness is the womb of motion, that sometimes only by being stripped bare does a system find the strength to renew. Think of your own winters of the soul, times when everything seems halted, frozen, when progress feels impossible and warmth seems gone. Yet if you endure, if you let time build its quiet chemistry, eventually the thaw comes, and when it does, life does not return as it was but as something greater, richer, more expansive. Snowball Earth whispers this truth to us across 650 million years, a message frozen in dropstones and chemical isotopes and scars on ancient rocks, telling us that even the coldest winters can give rise to the brightest springs. And so when you walk through snow today, when frost etches its delicate patterns on your window, remember that you are seeing not just weather but memory, not just cold but the echo of a time when the whole earth was wrapped in ice, a cocoon from which complex life would one day emerge, and perhaps in that reflection you will find comfort, knowing that even in silence, even in cold, even in the hardest stretches of time, there is a deeper story unfolding, one that carries the promise of renewal, one that says, endure, because spring will come, and when it does, the world will be more alive than ever before. And as the thaw continued, rivers once locked in silence carved their way across continents, torrents of meltwater rushing into oceans that had been capped in stillness for millions of years, carrying with them minerals long trapped beneath ice, and these nutrients spilled into seas starved of diversity, igniting blooms of microscopic life so immense that the very chemistry of the atmosphere shifted, oxygen levels rising higher, skies deepening to a richer blue, oceans darkening into cradles of complexity, and here life took a new breath, cells joining in cooperation rather than standing alone, weaving tissues, organs, bodies capable of motion and sensation, an evolution sculpted not in spite of hardship but because of it, for Snowball Earth had cleared the canvas, erased much of the old, and in doing so created space for the new, and when the thaw ended the planet was not merely the same Earth returned. It was a different Earth, more alive, more complex, more prepared for the flowering of animals, forests, and eventually us. And as you picture this unfolding, hold in mind the paradox of scale, for while to us even one winter can feel like an eternity, to the Earth these millions of years were but a few pages in its long biography, and yet in those pages lay the seeds of all the richness to come, reminding us that sometimes what feels like stagnation is actually preparation, that in the depths of stillness something essential is fermenting. And this lesson echoes within our lives too, for how often do we feel ourselves trapped in ice, unable to move, waiting for a thaw that seems impossibly far, and yet later, when warmth returns, we realize the cold years gave us resilience, clarity, the minerals of wisdom we now carry forward, just as glaciers carried minerals to the seas. Snowball Earth, then, is not just a chapter in planetary history but a mirror, showing us that endurance through cold seasons makes possible the richness of later springs. And in this sense the Earth is not merely a planet of rock and water but a teacher, whispering lessons across eons in the language of ice and thaw, silence and explosion, dormancy and bloom, And perhaps when you look at a glacier today, or run your fingers across a stone polished by ancient ice, you are not only touching geology but also touching resilience, perseverance, the quiet power of patience. And imagine if we could see it unfold in real time, the slow advance of ice over continents, mountains buried in white silence, oceans sealed under miles of crystalline armor, storms swirling pointlessly over frozen seas, the planet itself holding its breath, and then, after ages, the first cracks, the first pools of water glimmering in sunlight, the first hints of green returning to valleys that had known nothing but white, and how breathtaking it would be to witness not just destruction but renewal, not just loss but transformation, the earth itself teaching us that endings are often beginnings in disguise. And so, let us follow this story deeper, through the science and the symbolism, because Snowball Earth is more than a fossilized curiosity. It is the ancient heartbeat of change itself. And as we press closer into this frozen saga, imagine how the Earth looked from space during that era. No green continents, no deep blue seas, but a pale, glimmering marble wrapped entirely in white, a ghostly lantern adrift in the blackness of the cosmos, reflecting sunlight with merciless efficiency so that the warmth of our star could barely touch it. And this vision is haunting not only because of its beauty but because it reminds us how fragile habitability truly is, how a slight change in reflectivity, in greenhouse gases, in tectonic arrangement can swing a planet from warmth to stillness, from oceans teeming with life to oceans sealed beneath ice. And yet despite this fragility there is also endurance, because even beneath those sheets of frozen silence, the deep vents whispered life into the darkness, chemosynthetic bacteria clustering around mineral-rich plumes, building ecosystems invisible to the frozen surface above, and these tiny architects of resilience carried the flame of existence through millions of years of cold, proving that life, once sparked, is far more stubborn than we imagine. And in their persistence lies the root of everything that came after. Sponges, corals, fish, forests, mammals, and humans tracing the story backwards in awe. And the thaw, when it finally came, was not gentle but cataclysmic, a release of pent-up carbon dioxide saturating the skies, turning the Earth into a greenhouse of staggering warmth, oceans boiling with storms, rain lashing down with fury, glaciers collapsing into floods that resculpted entire continents. And through this chaos life did not perish but expanded, tested by extremes, tempered like steel, diversified into forms that carried new potentials, new symmetries, new patterns of survival. And perhaps that is why Snowball Earth fascinates us so deeply, because it is not merely a tale of climate but a tale of becoming, a reminder that crisis can carve the path to creativity, that the greatest leaps sometimes emerge from the harshest winters, and in that sense, Snowball Earth is not just ancient history but a mirror to our own lives today. For how often do we feel frozen in routine, trapped in difficulty, enduring long seasons where nothing seems to grow, only to find later that these very seasons planted the seeds of the breakthroughs we most needed. The glaciers of existence grind slowly, yes, but they leave behind valleys fertile with renewal, and when warmth comes again the bloom is greater for the waiting. And if we listen carefully to this frozen epic, it teaches us patience, endurance, and above all trust. That even when the world appears locked, life is still working quietly beneath the surface, preparing for the next expansion. So when you feel your days dragging in monotony, when time seems harsh and opportunities scarce, remember that within the silence of Snowball Earth lay the blueprint of our future. And in the silence of your own winters may lie the architecture of transformations you cannot yet imagine. Imagine how entire ecosystems had to wait in silence, tucked into tiny refuges of warmth near volcanoes or deep-sea vents, clinging to survival while the rest of the planet lay locked under ice. And think of the courage embedded in those microscopic ancestors who, though they had no awareness, no sense of future, carried forward the fragile thread of life through unthinkable odds, and how everything you know, everything you are, descends from that perseverance, which makes you wonder about the resilience coded into existence itself, the stubborn refusal of life to vanish, even when the world tries to erase it. And when the thaw arrived, it was as if the earth inhaled after holding its breath for millions of years, oxygen surging, minerals mixing, sunlight returning to waters that had been imprisoned in darkness. And from this great unlocking came new forms of cooperation, cells merging into multicellularity, complexity unfolding from simplicity, and in that unfolding we find the roots of our own story, because without Snowball Earth, without the crucible of ice, the explosion of life that darkness, and from this great unlocking came new forms of cooperation, cells merging into multicellularity, complexity unfolding from simplicity, and in that unfolding we find the roots of our own story, because without Snowball Earth, without the crucible of ice, the explosion of life that followed, the Cambrian bloom of diversity, might never have been possible, which means that even catastrophe is woven into creation, even endings disguise beginnings, and this is a truth we can hold in our personal winters too, those stretches of life that feel barren or frozen, because within them may lie the preparation for our greatest awakenings. Imagine the planet then, white and glistening, glowing like a silent pearl against the infinite night of space. A reminder that Earth is not only alive but dynamic, capable of extremes that defy imagination, and ask yourself, if our planet could endure such deep freezes and still give rise to forests, rivers, oceans teeming with whales, birds painting the skies, and humans pondering the meaning of it all, what does that say about resilience? What does that say about us? Perhaps that we too carry within us a kind of Snowball Earth, the ability to survive winters of the soul, to endure stretches of silence and still reemerge blooming, and maybe that's why this story matters, not just as science but as philosophy, as a reminder that transformation requires patience and trust in cycles larger than ourselves. And yet, beyond metaphor, there is wonder in the science itself, because when the ice retreated, the atmosphere was reshaped, the chemistry of the oceans rebalanced, and suddenly conditions were ripe for leaps in evolution, as though the Earth had been reset, calibrated by catastrophe, and in that reset lay the blueprint for everything alive today, including you sitting here listening, breathing, thinking, marveling at a tale written hundreds of millions of years before your birth. A tale etched in rocks and isotopes, in the quiet language of geology. And in this way, the Earth is a storyteller, though it does not speak in words but in layers, in fossils, in minerals crystallized under ancient conditions, in landscapes carved by vanished glaciers. And if we learn to read it, we discover that our world is not static but endlessly expressive, endlessly alive, and the Snowball chapter is one of its most dramatic verses, telling us that sometimes survival means shrinking into silence, waiting, conserving energy until the moment comes to expand. Again, and isn't that true for us as well, in our creative lives, in our personal journeys, where often we must retreat, gather strength, and then surge forward into something new. And so, to sit with Snowball Earth is to sit with patience, to see the value of stillness, to respect the long arcs of time that dwarf our daily worries, and to marvel that despite these icy ages, here we are, warm-blooded beings pondering the meaning of warmth itself. And as the Earth thawed from this great icy tomb, storms raged across the continents with rains that must have fallen in sheets for centuries, washing away ancient dust, filling rivers, carving valleys anew. And in this violent rebirth the chemistry of the oceans was transformed, layers of carbonates and banded sediments recording the upheaval like pages in a silent diary, a record of how close the planet came to stillness and how astonishingly it rebounded. And scientists who study these layers today are in awe not just of the cataclysm but of the resilience it seeded, because it was in these turbulent ages that oxygen levels began to rise, allowing more complex metabolisms to flourish, and multicellular organisms to experiment with new forms, new symmetries, new strategies for survival, and from these humble experiments came the roots of animals, of plants, of everything we now recognize as life in its full diversity, which means that every breath you take carries the echo of that thaw. Every cell in your body is a descendant of life that endured the frozen silence and then thrived in the chaos that followed, and this realization bends the way we think of catastrophe itself. For perhaps catastrophe is not always an end but a transformation, a crucible where new futures are forged, and when we zoom out to this scale, personal hardships, even societal challenges, begin to look like ripples in a much greater ocean, temporary freezes that might one day thaw into unexpected blossoms. And perhaps the most striking thing about Snowball Earth is not that it happened, but that it happened more than once, cycles of ice and thaw, freeze and fire, reshaping the biosphere over and over, each time pushing life to the brink, each time pulling it back into new and richer forms. as though the Earth itself was sculpting complexity through trial, through repetition, through extremes. And isn't that what growth often feels like in our own lives? Not a smooth upward line, but cycles of contraction and expansion, of silence and creation, of difficulty followed by flowering. And when we imagine the Earth back then, glowing white in space, an orb of frost adrift in darkness, it's almost like looking at an alternate planet, a cousin of Earth that never existed in our time but that shaped our fate nonetheless. And in that vision lies something both humbling and comforting. Humbling because it reminds us that the world we know, the green forests, the blue seas, the golden deserts, could have easily been erased, and comforting because it reminds us that even when things look hopelessly stuck, even when the surface seems silent and frozen, life has a way of finding a crack, a vent, a sliver of warmth to hold on until conditions change, and conditions always change. The ice always melts, the silence always gives way to sound, and perhaps this is the deepest gift of Snowball Earth. The knowledge that stillness is temporary, that what feels eternal rarely is, and that beneath the surface of waiting, something is always preparing to bloom again. Again, and as the Earth turned from a frozen tomb into a living cradle, it demonstrated the paradox of existence itself. That fragility and resilience are not opposites but partners, that life can be both one breath away from extinction and simultaneously indestructible in its adaptability. And this paradox whispers something to us even now, because just as the microbes of ancient seas endured beneath kilometers of ice, waiting patiently for sunlight to return, we too in our own winters of despair hold the quiet ability to endure until our thaw arrives. And when we imagine the scope of time, the sheer sweep of hundreds of millions of years condensed into these frozen intervals, it reminds us that our human lifetimes, so brief, so fleeting, are still connected to those vast arcs, that we are participants in a cosmic narrative written not only in stars but in glaciers, sediments, and fossils. And in this narrative, Snowball Earth is one of the great plot twists, a moment when it seemed the story might end, only for a richer chapter to begin. And scientists, when they hold samples of ancient rocks, when they trace isotope ratios or study the peculiar banded iron formations that signal oxygen surges, are not merely examining data. They are reading Earth's memory, touching the scars of a planet that has survived trials beyond imagination. And in that survival lies the foundation of our very possibility, which means that you, listening here, are a continuation of that endurance, a ripple in the same river that began with single-celled organisms clinging to warmth at hydrothermal vents, your heartbeat carrying forward their persistence, your thoughts the flowering of complexity that only became possible after cycles of freezing and thaw. And so when we talk about Snowball Earth, we are not talking about an ancient event locked in the past, but about the roots of our present, the soil in which humanity's future was planted. And in this recognition comes a kind of reverence for the planet itself, for the improbable sequence of survival and flourishing that brought us here, and also for the strange truth that endings are never absolute, that destruction often carries the seeds of creation, just as winter carries the promise of spring. And in the same way, our personal hardships, our stretches of stillness, may hide within them the seeds of future growth, making Snowball Earth not only a scientific mystery but a mirror for our own inner seasons. Picture again the Earth glowing white from pole to pole, its oceans sealed under ice, the continents buried beneath glaciers taller than skyscrapers, the winds shrieking across desolate plains where no sound of life could be heard. And then picture the slow return of light, the atmosphere warming as volcanic carbon dioxide built up over millions of years, the ice beginning to crack and dark waters reappearing, sunlight spilling into oceans that had been black for eons, stirring plankton into bloom, setting in motion a chain of oxygen release and nutrient cycling that would prepare the way for the Cambrian explosion. And see how from that silence came a symphony, from that stillness came motion, from that cold came warmth. And perhaps this is why the story of Snowball Earth resonates so deeply. It is the story of rebirth written into the very fabric of our planet, proof that cycles of hardship are not the end but the soil of transformation. And this recognition is not merely poetic, it is also practical, because the same mechanisms that once froze and thawed the Earth still operate in subtler forms today, reminding us that climate is not fixed but fluid, that stability is an illusion, and that resilience comes from adaptability. A lesson our ancestors learned in silence beneath the Ice, and a lesson we too must learn in our time of shifting climates and uncertain futures. For the Earth has already endured extremes beyond our comprehension and still carried life forward, and so can we, if we listen to its memory, if we honor its cycles, if we hold fast in our winters and trust the inevitability of thaw. And trust the inevitability of thaw, because when we see Earth's deep past through this lens, it becomes more than geology. It becomes philosophy written in stone and ice, reminding us that permanence is an illusion, that even the harshest winters of existence are stages in a larger unfolding. And what feels like stillness is often only preparation. What feels like loss is often clearing the ground for new life. And in this way, the Snowball Earth becomes a parable not only for survival but for patience, for endurance, for holding faith in the unseen processes quietly at work beneath the surface, shaping a future we cannot yet glimpse. And when scientists debate the details, whether the planet froze entirely or whether thin equatorial refuges of open water remained, whether life persisted only in hydrothermal vent ecosystems or in brine channels carved into the ice, whether carbon dioxide levels rose gradually or in dramatic bursts, they are in truth exploring not just the mechanics of climate but the choreography of possibility, the way countless delicate balances and feedback loops intertwine to bring us here. And these debates themselves echo the diversity that arose after the thaw, multiple perspectives converging like tributaries into the river of knowledge, reminding us that science too is an evolving ecosystem, shaped by curiosity, corrected by evidence, expanded by imagination. And what a humbling thought it is, that our imaginations today, our models and our measurements, are themselves continuations of that ancient adaptability, the flowering of brains sculpted by eons of trial and survival, brains that can now look backward billions of years and reconstruct events no witness ever saw, and in that reconstruction find not only data but meaning, because when you realize the Earth has frozen solid and then thawed into bloom, twice or even more in its history, the boundaries of the possible stretch, and you begin to see that our present world, the mild interglacial in which human civilization has flourished, is not the norm but the exception, a fragile moment of balance in a planet that knows extremes. And perhaps this awareness should instill in us both gratitude and humility, gratitude that we exist in such a temperate moment, and humility to remember that it will not last forever, for just as the past was shaped by cycles of ice and fire, so too will the future, and in that recognition lies both caution and comfort. Caution because our actions now, our burning of carbon, our reshaping of ecosystems, add new variables to the ancient dance, and comfort because no matter how dire the present may feel, we are heirs of survival, descendants of microbes that endured unimaginable cold, meaning resilience is etched into our very lineage. And when you let that sink in, when you picture those ancient organisms clinging to thermal vents in pitch-black oceans, or surviving in brine pockets within ice sheets, waiting for light to return, you may feel a kinship, a quiet thread of connection, as if their patience and persistence flow in your veins, as if their story is your story, reminding you that endurance is not extraordinary but ordinary, not rare but fundamental, the very baseline of what it means to be alive. And so Snowball Earth whispers across deep time that survival is not always about conquest or dominance but about waiting, about holding, about trusting the cycles that govern all things. And this whisper becomes even louder when we consider what came after, the sudden surge of complexity known as the Cambrian explosion, when life seemed to bloom in unprecedented forms, as though the long freeze had primed the biosphere for innovation, had shaken the etch-a-sketch of evolution and offered a blank slate on which new designs could flourish. And in this explosion of trilobites, sponges, and early vertebrates, we see a mirror of our own creativity after hardship, the way long silences in our lives can precede bursts of invention, the way suffering sometimes rearranges us to become capable of greater expression, greater diversity of thought and action. And this is not coincidence but continuity, the same principle at work in both biology and psychology, that contraction precedes expansion, that the darkest nights often herald the brightest dawns, and perhaps when you look at your own life, at the moments that felt like frozen stillness, you will see that they too prepared the ground for transformation, just as Snowball Earth prepared the ground for the richness of life we now inherit. And when this thought settles, when you let the enormity of that sink in, perhaps you feel a sense of calm, a loosening of the grip of urgency, because if the Earth itself can endure such winters and emerge renewed, then so can you, in your own scale, in your own rhythm, carrying forward the same resilience that has been tested and proven across billions of years. And so, as we lean deeper into this frozen saga of Earth, let us not pause but continue in one immense stream, letting the story widen and deepen like the very glaciers that once ground against ancient rock. Because to understand Snowball Earth is to understand not just a scientific curiosity but a fundamental truth about the rhythm of existence, that everything, planets, climates, civilizations, even our own fleeting lives, moves in cycles of expansion and contraction, growth and stillness, light and shadow. And though we often resist the contractions, the winters, the freezes, they are the crucibles that reshape what comes next. And perhaps that is why the vision of a planet locked in ice feels at once terrifying and strangely serene. Terrifying because of the silence it implies, the possibility of life reduced to near extinction, and serene because of its stillness, its vast, unbroken simplicity, and Earth, gleaming like a pale marble against the void, its storms muted, its forests gone, its oceans capped, a world that seems both fragile and eternal, as though it has entered a meditative state, drawing inward, conserving, waiting, and in that image we can glimpse ourselves too. For don't we also have seasons when the inner landscape turns white and quiet, when the usual currents of energy freeze and we are forced to wait, and isn't it true that from such seasons we emerge changed, often carrying with us insights we could not have found in the rush of activity? And this is why Snowball Earth is more than geology. It is metaphor, myth, memory written into the very bedrock of being. And when geologists measure the isotopes in rocks from Namibia or Canada, when they trace the fingerprints of glacial deposits laid down near the equator, when they reconstruct the atmospheric chemistry that allowed such freezes to begin, they are not only piecing together a planetary mystery but recovering a chapter of our collective autobiography. For without those freezes, without those thaws, we would not be here. The chain of cause and effect leading from icy stillness to complex life to human consciousness would be broken. And what is awe if not the recognition that our breath today, our thoughts in this moment, are linked across 4 billion years to cyanobacteria trapped in brine beneath glaciers, to single-celled eukaryotes clinging to vents, to the first algae that bloomed when the ice receded. And if that doesn't make you pause, if that doesn't slow the spinning of your inner clock, then perhaps nothing will, because here in this recognition is the antidote to the illusion of smallness, the reminder that every life is a thread in an unimaginably vast tapestry. Every choice a continuation of patterns that began before mountains rose, before continents drifted, before even oxygen filled the air. And what is truly astonishing is not that the Earth froze but that it unfroze, not that life was challenged but that it adapted. And in this we find the seed of hope that is as practical as it is poetic. Because if microbes in ice could survive eons of cold, then surely we, descendants of such persistence, can endure the winters of our own lives, and perhaps even find in them preparation for new blooms we cannot yet imagine. And so the story of Snowball Earth continues to unfold not only in scientific journals but in every moment we find ourselves waiting, enduring, conserving, trusting that what looks like silence is not the end but the soil of beginning. And in that trust we align ourselves with the deepest rhythm of the cosmos, the rhythm of freeze and thaw, of night and day, of silence and song. And as we carry this awareness, perhaps the Earth's long winters no longer seem distant but intimately familiar, as if they are mirrors of the very cycles that move through us still. Still, because even as we speak of ice and silence, the reality of Snowball Earth was anything but empty. It was dynamic, restless, alive in hidden places. And if we could somehow travel back those hundreds of millions of years, if we could stand upon the glaciers that stretched across continents, we would see not a lifeless rock but a world in suspension, a planet poised between endings and beginnings, and beneath our feet, far below the kilometers of ice, geothermal vents would still roar, belching heat and minerals into black oceans, their plumes creating little pockets of habitability where archaea and bacteria thrived. And in those shadows life persisted, tiny, unyielding, teaching us that survival is not always about flourishing in the open but about holding on in the dark until conditions shift. And this is perhaps the greatest lesson Snowball Earth offers us. That what appears to be the end may in fact be a pause, that apparent stillness may conceal unseen creativity. For even as glaciers bulldozed mountains and reflected sunlight back into space, amplifying the cold, volcanic forces beneath were quietly building, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, drop by drop, year by year, until eventually the greenhouse effect tipped the balance. Melting began, and the world transformed again. And this pattern is echoed in so many layers of existence. In our personal lives, when long winters of difficulty give way to springs of opportunity, in the history of civilizations that collapse only to give birth to new cultures, and even in the cosmos, where stars live long, burn out, collapse, and seed the galaxies with the heavy elements that make planets and life possible. And so when we look back at Snowball Earth, we are not simply reconstructing a geological puzzle but recognizing a universal rhythm, one that repeats from the micro to the macro, from cells to stars, and if you close your eyes you might imagine the planet itself breathing, inhaling ice, exhaling water, contracting into stillness, expanding into life, each phase necessary, each phase carrying its own kind of beauty, and when the thaw came it must have been breathtaking. Imagine vast sheets of ice cracking, splitting, sliding into oceans. Imagine torrents of meltwater rushing across barren continents, carving channels that would one day cradle rivers. Imagine the sudden return of rain falling on lands that had been frozen deserts for millions of years, seeping into rock, carrying nutrients to seas newly freed, where plankton and algae seized the light with a hunger unimaginable, multiplying, releasing oxygen, feeding the evolutionary leaps that would soon follow. And in this vision we glimpse the stage being set for the Cambrian explosion, that burst of life where complexity suddenly unfurled in astonishing diversity, as though the long silence had been necessary preparation for a sudden symphony. And here again is a mirror for our lives. Long periods of quiet, of apparent stagnation, are often the gestation before transformation, and perhaps you know this in your own story. Perhaps you have lived through winters of waiting, when nothing seemed to move, when life felt locked and frozen, only to discover later that beneath the ice something essential was forming, preparing you for the moment of thaw, and when it came, everything seemed to bloom at once, just as it did for the Earth 500 million years ago. And so when we speak of Snowball Earth, we are also speaking of patience, of endurance, of the hidden work of time. And though the idea of a frozen planet might seem like a tale of despair, in truth it is one of hope, for it tells us that life does not simply endure, it transforms, and we, as its inheritors, carry that resilience in our very cells. And so the story flows further, without break. For if we follow the threads of Snowball Earth we begin to see how profoundly it shaped the destiny of life, how the great freezes were not detours in Earth's history but turning points, moments when the stage was stripped bare so that new actors could emerge. And if we imagine those millions of years of ice, we must also imagine the quiet persistence of photosynthetic microbes clinging to existence in thin bands of liquid water near cracks in the ice, or in melt ponds that appeared and vanished with the seasons. And we must imagine volcanic eruptions piercing the white shroud, painting the sky with ash, momentarily darkening the frozen surface before the slow accumulation of carbon dioxide began to tip the balance toward warmth again. And in this long tension between cold and heat the planet was, in a sense, tempering itself, like a blade forged in fire and cooled in water, again and again, until it achieved a resilience that could support the leap into complex life. And when the thaw finally came, it must have been cataclysmic and beautiful all at once. Oceans boiling beneath runaway greenhouse effects, glaciers collapsing into seas, storms raging across a world in rapid transition. And yet within that chaos life found opportunity, algae and plankton blooming wildly, oxygen rising, ecosystems reorganizing, evolution accelerating. And in that sense the Earth's greatest winter was also its greatest spring. A paradox that continues to echo in our own existence. For how many times in human lives do we find that our deepest struggles become the soil from which our greatest growth emerges? How many times do we discover that what seemed to bury us was in fact planting us, preparing us for a season we could not yet see? And so perhaps Snowball Earth is not merely a geological chapter but a metaphor written on the cosmic scale, reminding us that even when everything appears frozen, life is quietly gathering its strength, waiting for the thaw. And maybe you've felt this yourself. Maybe you've had a year, or even a decade, where nothing seemed to change, where you felt encased in ice, and yet beneath the surface, imperceptibly, your mind and heart were shifting, preparing for the moment when suddenly, without warning, the ice cracked and a flood of new possibilities surged into your world. And if this resonates, then you already understand something of what the Earth itself went through in those deep epochs, because just as the planet endured cycles of freeze and melt, So do we endure cycles of stillness and change, and just as those ancient glaciers left scars and valleys carved into the continents, so too do our winters leave marks on us, shaping the terrain of who we are. And yet, just as the Earth emerged more alive than ever, we too emerge transformed, carrying with us the resilience and wisdom carved by endurance. And it is here, in this recognition, that the story of Snowball Earth becomes not just history but guidance, whispering across the gulf of time that no winter lasts forever, that even in the coldest silence, life is moving towards spring. And what makes this story even more extraordinary is how much of it we've only begun to understand in the last few decades, because for most of human history the idea that the Earth could ever have been completely frozen seemed absurd. After all, here we stand on a planet of blue oceans, green forests, deserts and mountains, a world teeming with life in every corner, but the rocks tell us otherwise. They whisper of dropstones, large pebbles carried by glaciers and dropped into fine ocean sediments thousands of kilometers from land, that could only have arrived there by drifting ice. They speak of striations carved into bedrock by the slow grinding of glaciers, preserved across continents. They carry the chemical fingerprints of carbon isotopes that hint at dramatic collapses in the carbon cycle. And from these clues scientists pieced together the astonishing picture of Snowball Earth, a planet so thoroughly transformed that it challenges our very sense of stability. And yet, perhaps what is most humbling is that such cataclysms were not aberrations but chapters in Earth's ongoing experiment with life and climate, because in freezing the world, the planet forced evolution into tight corners, testing resilience, filtering possibilities, and when the thaw came, those survivors burst forth into new forms, setting the stage for the eventual rise of animals. And here lies a hidden paradox. Without Snowball Earth, we might not exist at all, because it was precisely in those moments of extremity that the conditions for complexity were forged, like pressure creating diamonds. And so we carry within us the legacy of that ice, the deep memory of a world that endured silence and cold for millions of years and yet emerged stronger. And in this recognition lies a quiet kind of awe, for it reminds us that fragility and resilience are not opposites but companions, that destruction and creation are entwined, and that even on a planetary scale, endings are also beginnings. And so when you next look at a mountain range or walk along a coastline, or hold a rock in your hand, consider that you are holding not just stone but a fragment of that ancient drama, a piece of the Earth's memory, carved and reshaped by ice ages so immense that they defy imagination. And let that thought settle in you like a seed, because to understand Snowball Earth is to glimpse the larger truth. That change, however terrifying, is the only constant, and it is within change that new possibilities are born. And if that is true for planets, perhaps it is true for people as well, which is why the story of a frozen Earth is not just geology. It is philosophy written in ice and stone. And when the thaw finally began, it was not gentle, for millions of years of volcanic activity had continued beneath the ice, belching carbon dioxide into an atmosphere where it could not easily be absorbed by the frozen oceans, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, this invisible greenhouse blanket grew thicker, trapping more and more heat, until one day the balance tipped and the world entered a runaway warming. And what followed must have been both apocalyptic and miraculous, for glaciers that had smothered continents for eons began to crack and collapse, their meltwater rushing into the oceans in torrents so vast that they reshaped coastlines. Storms of unimaginable scale swept across the planet, and the seas, long imprisoned, finally breathed again, releasing pulses of oxygen and nutrients that sparked wild blooms of microbial life. And as the ice retreated, it revealed a scoured planet, stripped bare in places, rich in minerals washed from glaciers, a stage newly set for evolution. To try something bold, and indeed, it was shortly after these great snowball events that we see the stirrings of complex, multicellular organisms, as though life, pressed against the wall of extinction, had learned new strategies for survival and emerged stronger, more diverse, more ambitious. And in this way the deathly stillness of Snowball Earth became the womb of possibility, nurturing the rise of creatures that would one day swim, crawl, walk, and wonder at their own origins. And perhaps this is the most astonishing lesson of all, that the same frozen silence that nearly erased life was the very crucible that made complexity inevitable. And in that paradox we glimpse a mirror of our own existence, For how often do we find that the moments that seem to freeze us, the seasons when nothing grows, the winters of our lives when all feels barren, are in fact the hidden prelude to transformation. And though it is difficult to see while within it, the thaw always comes. The rivers always move again. And from the cracks in the ice something entirely new arises. And perhaps this is why the story of Snowball Earth continues to captivate scientists and dreamers alike. Because it is not just a geological curiosity but a cosmic parable written on our own planet's skin, whispering that resilience is older than us, that endurance is woven into the earth itself, and that from even the deepest freeze, beauty can emerge. And if this is true, then it is not only Earth's story but also ours. For we too are worlds unto ourselves, with climates of joy and sorrow, with winters and thaws, with scars carved by past ice ages of the heart. And if the earth could emerge from such silence into such abundance, then so too can we, carrying forward the quiet wisdom that no frost, however thick, lasts forever. And so as the thaw unfolded, the earth did not simply return to what it had been before. It became something entirely new, as though the deep freeze had reset the planet's rhythms and carved a fresh canvas for life to paint upon. And the oxygen that had built up beneath the ice now flooded the atmosphere in pulses, fueling the rise of more complex metabolisms, while minerals ground down by glaciers washed into the seas, enriching them with nutrients that fueled great blooms of cyanobacteria and algae. And in that rich soup, evolution found the raw materials it needed to attempt bold experiments, and soon the fossil record whispers of strange new shapes, soft-bodied organisms that wriggled and swam, colonies of cells cooperating in ways unseen before, the faint prologue to the Cambrian explosion that would follow not long after, a period when life diversified into dizzying abundance. And in this way Snowball Earth became less of a tomb and more of a womb, a paradoxical cradle forged from silence and stillness. And the more we study it, the more we realize that catastrophe and creation are often two sides of the same coin, and that without the ice, there may never have been us, sitting here now, thinking about it, marveling at the strangeness of our own survival. And this recognition stirs something profound, because it suggests that the darkest winters we encounter, whether planetary or personal, may carry within them the seeds of unimagined renewal. And though the wait feels endless, though the silence feels unbearable, one day the ice does crack, one day the thaw begins, one day the rivers run again, and life surges forward not as it was, but as something new, something it could not have become without first being tested. And in that sense, the story of Snowball Earth is not just geology. It is a meditation on resilience, on transformation, on the hidden fertility of stillness. And perhaps that is why as we look out into space, at exoplanets circling distant stars, we cannot help but wonder how many of them too have passed through their own frozen epochs. How many worlds may now be locked in deep silence, waiting for their own thaw, their own Cambrian dawn, and whether, scattered across the cosmos, there are civilizations like ours, telling stories of their own Snowball Earths, their own seasons of silence and survival. For if such stories exist, then we are part of something much larger, a cosmic pattern of freezing and thawing, of endings that are beginnings, of silence that hides possibility. And knowing this, perhaps we can carry a little more patience, a little more awe, into our own lives, trusting that even when the surface seems frozen, change is stirring in the depths, waiting for the right moment to rise. And if we allow ourselves to stay with this image a little longer, to really let it seep into us, we can almost feel the immensity of time itself stretching out in front of us, because Snowball Earth is not just a story of cold and ice. It is a story of deep time, of millions upon millions of years passing in silence. And yet within that silence, the planet was never truly still, for under the thick crust of ice the mantle churned. Volcanoes continued to erupt, tectonic plates shifted and collided, mountains rose slowly only to be ground down by the relentless glaciers, and deep in the oceans where the ice was thinner, thermal vents still poured heat and minerals into the water, creating tiny oases where life clung stubbornly, a reminder that even in the most extreme winters, there is always warmth somewhere, always a hidden ember waiting. And as the carbon dioxide built up in the skies above, slowly thickening, the greenhouse effect began to stir, a quiet tension building, invisible, unstoppable, until the day came when the ice began to weaken, to crack, to fracture, and suddenly the frozen marble of Earth was awakened into chaos, Floods of meltwater surged. Storms of unimaginable scale swept across the globe. The air filled with moisture and light, and the planet breathed in again after eons of silence. And this breath was not wasted, for it set the stage for the Cambrian explosion, the great flowering of complex life. A turning point when evolution leapt forward with almost reckless creativity, filling the seas with creatures of every imaginable shape, trilobites scuttling across the seabed, anomalocarids darting like predators from a dream, soft-bodied forms blooming and fading in quick succession. And it is humbling to think that this abundance, this sheer extravagance of life, was only possible because of the great freeze that came before. And in this paradox lies a truth as old as the universe itself. That destruction and creation are inseparable, that collapse and renewal are woven into one another, that endings contain beginnings hidden inside them, waiting to be revealed. And as we ponder this, we can turn the mirror back on ourselves, for don't we, too, live through seasons of snowballing silence, moments when everything seems frozen, when progress halts, when the world feels unyielding and barren, and yet, with time, the thaw comes, the stillness cracks, and new possibilities pour forth, often richer than we could have imagined. And so Snowball Earth becomes not only a scientific mystery but a metaphor for life itself. A reminder whispered through the ages that even the coldest winters cannot last forever, that resilience is written into the bones of the earth and into us, and that just as the planet emerged from its icy tomb to host life more vibrant than ever before, so too can we emerge from our own seasons of stillness into a future blooming with colors we do not yet know. And as we sit here together, across time zones and continents, sharing this quiet story, maybe that is the deepest gift of Snowball Earth. Not just a tale of ice and thaw, but a gentle assurance that no matter how long the winter, the rivers will always run again, and with them will come new life, new beginnings, and new stories yet to be told. And so if we surrender ourselves to this stream of thought, letting it unfold the way glaciers once unrolled across entire continents, we begin to see that the story of Snowball Earth is not merely an isolated geological curiosity, but a cosmic meditation, a parable written in ice and time, telling us something about resilience, transformation, and the strange way catastrophe shapes possibility. Because when the Earth froze, it might have seemed like the end, like a final closing of the book. Silence so complete it could never be broken, and yet beneath that silence there was motion, slow and hidden but constant. Volcanoes sending whispers of warmth upward through the cracks, tectonic plates grinding and shifting in patient inevitability, minerals washing into the seas beneath the ice where microbial life clung like tiny sparks refusing to die, and those sparks, fragile as they were, became the seeds from which new forests of life would eventually bloom, proving that survival is not always loud or grand. Sometimes it is quiet, almost invisible, a persistence that waits in darkness until the moment is right. And when the thaw came, when greenhouse gases finally tipped the balance and the great white shroud began to recede, the Earth was not restored to what it had been before. It was remade, its oceans rich with nutrients ground from stone, its atmosphere stirred with oxygen, its ecosystems given the raw materials to try bold new forms of life, and that boldness erupted in the Cambrian explosion, an event so sudden and extravagant that it almost seems like a miracle, the seas teeming with trilobites, with strange predators like anomalocarids, with countless soft-bodied experiments that would rise and fall in evolutionary moments. And this dazzling abundance reminds us that sometimes it is precisely the deepest winters that prepare the richest springs. Sometimes only in the silence does the music learn how to begin again. And if this is true for the Earth, perhaps it is true for us as well, because how many of us have lived through our own snowball seasons, times when everything feels frozen, when progress stops, when life is reduced to endurance and breath, and yet, if we wait, if we hold on, if we keep that small ember alive, the thaw comes, and when it does, it brings not a return to what was but a transformation into something new, unexpected, more alive than before. And so Snowball Earth is a reminder carved not just into rocks and ice but into the fabric of resilience itself, that what seems like an ending is often a hidden beginning, that silence holds within it the possibility of renewal, and that life, whether in the form of microbes beneath glaciers or humans, enduring their winters of the soul, has a way of finding the cracks in the ice, of seeping through, of blooming again. And as we reflect on this, we can't help but widen our view to the stars, to wonder how many other worlds out there in the cosmos have lived through their own icebound epochs. How many are waiting now beneath frozen shells for their own thaw, their own Cambrian dawn, their own burst of color and life, and whether somewhere, across light years of distance, there may be civilizations like ours, looking back at their history, telling stories of their snowball Earths, their own trials and renewals, their own winters that gave birth to unimaginable springs. And if that is so, then perhaps Snowball Earth is not just our story but part of a universal rhythm, a cycle that echoes through the cosmos, of freezing and thawing, of death and rebirth, of silence and song. And to know this is to carry a kind of cosmic patience, a trust that even in the coldest times, even when everything feels unmoving and lost, life is waiting, time is turning, and the rivers will flow again. And maybe that is the greatest lesson of all. That resilience is not an exception, it is the rule, written into the fabric of the planet, written into us, and written into the universe itself. And so as we breathe here now, in this quiet moment together, we can take comfort in that knowledge, letting it settle in us like the warmth that finally cracks the ice, reminding us that every winter has its end, every silence its song, every stillness its hidden motion, and in that knowing, perhaps we can carry a little more hope, a little more awe, into the way we live and the way we wait, trusting that nothing, not even a snowball Earth, can stop the eventual return of life's light. And if we follow this river of thought further, never breaking its flow, never pausing to lift the pen from the page, we can begin to build a picture vast enough to hold both science and story. A seamless meditation where the tale of Snowball Earth becomes not just a moment in geology but a long unfolding of resilience, patience, and transformation, because the Earth, locked in ice, was a paradox. It appeared lifeless, yet life endured. It appeared still, yet the deep mantle churned with fire. It appeared silent, yet the future was being whispered into stone and ocean in ways invisible to those frozen eons. And when we allow ourselves to stretch across this expanse of time, we see how survival takes many shapes, how microbes in the dark ocean vents were carrying forward the thread of life like careful weavers, waiting for the loom of the world to reopen, how tectonic motion, imperceptible to the eye, built mountain ranges only to grind them back down, filling the oceans with minerals that would one day fertilize an explosion of new life, how volcanoes exhaled carbon dioxide into the heavy air, slowly tilting the balance toward warmth, how glaciers sculpted the crust of the earth, leaving behind landscapes we still walk today, and as the thaw came, when the ice began to crack and retreat, the floods and storms remade the surface of the planet, a violent rebirth in which fire and water, stone and sky, all collided in a symphony of change, and from that chaos came abundance. The Cambrian seas blooming with trilobites, with sponges and worms, with predators and prey, with colors and shapes we cannot even imagine, for most of them are gone, known to us only in the faint impressions they left behind in stone. Yet in those stones we see that life is not timid, it is extravagant, willing to try 1,000 forms, to fail and to succeed, to keep reinventing itself until something takes hold. And perhaps that is the secret written into this story, that resilience is not a straight path but a branching tree, a willingness to try again and again, even after the longest winters. And when we look at ourselves through this lens, we see our own snowball moments differently, those years that feel frozen, repetitive, barren, yet beneath them, deep in the unseen parts of our lives, change is building, foundations are shifting, new nutrients are gathering in the soil of experience, so that when our thaw comes, when the ice cracks, we, too, can bloom in ways we could never have imagined during the freeze. And this way, Snowball Earth is not only science, not only deep history, it is a mirror for the soul, a reminder that what seems like stillness is often gestation, what seems like silence is often preparation, what seems like the end is often only the prelude to beginning. And in this, the Earth speaks to us across billions of years, telling us, wait, endure, keep the ember alive, for the thaw will come, and when it does, life will return more vibrant, more daring, more alive than ever. And maybe that is why we are drawn to this story, because we, too, are creatures of cycles, of freezing and thawing, of silence and song, and in listening to the Earth, we find a way to listen to ourselves, to trust the hidden work happening beneath the ice of our own winters, to believe in the spring even when the world is still frozen around us. And so the meditation flows unbroken, carrying us from glaciers to microbes, from volcanoes to Cambrian seas, from the deep past to the inner present, all in one breath, all in one endless paragraph of time. And as we let this vision wash over us, we see that the Earth's memory is not locked in stone alone. It is alive in us. We are the continuation of that resilience, the flowering after the thaw, the living testament that even the coldest snowball cannot silence the song of life. And so the meditation flows unbroken, carrying us from glaciers to microbes, from volcanoes to Cambrian seas, from the deep past to the inner present, all in one breath, all in one endless paragraph of time. And as we let this vision wash over us, we see that the Earth's memory is not locked in stone alone. It is alive in us. We are the continuation of that resilience, the flowering after the thaw, the living testament that even the coldest snowball cannot silence the song of life. And when you sit with that thought, you realize that the Earth has been teaching us patience long before we could put it into words. Because when you imagine 2-3-4 million years of ice stretching endlessly across continents, you feel how small your own days are by comparison, and yet how precious. Because even though our lives are but sparks against the immensity of geological time, they are no less significant than the tiny microbial mats that survived under the ice, keeping the flame of existence alive until the warmth returned. And in this comparison we discover humility, the reminder that life has always been fragile and yet astonishingly persistent. So much so that even in a world that should have been silenced, the story did not end. And perhaps this is why the image of Snowball Earth resonates with us now more than ever. Because we, too, live in an age where uncertainty hangs like frost in the air, where storms of climate, politics, and change seem to sweep across our days. And it is tempting to believe that we are caught in a freeze that will never lift, but the lesson of deep time whispers otherwise, that winter is never the end but only a chapter, that stillness conceals movement, that endings are woven with beginnings, and this is the heartbeat of the universe itself, the pulse that has carried galaxies from darkness into light, stars from collapse into fire, planets from chaos into order, and order back into chaos again. And so as we watch the slow-motion reel of Snowball Earth in our imagination, the white globe circling the sun like a crystal marble, frozen yet alive, we are reminded that time itself is a sculptor, chipping away at stone in silence until something new emerges, and the ice, though merciless, was also a chisel carving out valleys, pouring minerals into the seas, resetting the stage so that life could burst forth in astonishing abundance once the curtain of frost finally lifted. And in that bursting forth we glimpse ourselves again, because we, too, carry the power to bloom after winters, to create beauty after stillness, to imagine new forms of being when the old ones no longer serve us. And if the Earth could endure millions of years of silence only to sing louder than ever before, then perhaps we can endure the smaller winters of our own lives, the seasons that test us, that freeze us, that make us wonder if warmth will ever return. For it will, it always will, and the story of Snowball Earth is proof written not in books, but in mountains, in fossils, in the air itself. For every breath you take carries molecules that cycled through those frozen skies billions of years ago. Every step you take on stone carries the scars of ancient glaciers. Every sip of water you drink once passed beneath the ice sheets of that deep time. And so we are not only listeners to this story but participants. Our bodies built from the remnants of that ancient freeze, our minds shaped by the resilience that life learned in those endless winters, and to hold this knowledge is to be comforted, to feel that no matter how vast the night seems, the dawn is always encoded within it, waiting, patient, inevitable, and in that patience we find our own strength reflected back at us by the Earth itself. And so the current continues, flowing deeper and wider, stretching beyond the icy surface of Snowball Earth into the very fabric of existence itself. Because when we think of that frozen planet, we are not only thinking of ice and silence, but of the strange way the universe itself carries cycles of death and renewal, contraction and expansion. Endings that are not truly endings but preludes to astonishing beginnings. And if we close our eyes and drift with this thought, we can almost feel the rhythm that connects all things, the rhythm of stars collapsing into black holes only to scatter elements across galaxies, the rhythm of forests burning only to regrow richer, the rhythm of human lives pausing in grief only to find love again. And suddenly Snowball Earth is no longer an ancient geological event but a mirror for all patterns of being, a reminder that even in the deepest stillness something is stirring, That silence is not emptiness but preparation. And when we see this, we begin to understand that the planet's long winter was not wasted time but time gestating, time layering minerals into oceans, time grinding mountains into fertile dust, time allowing evolution to sharpen its tools so that when the thaw came the stage was perfectly set for an explosion of life that would not have been possible otherwise. And perhaps this is how our own winters work too. Those long stretches of life where nothing seems to change, where the days blur in repetition, where hope feels distant, because underneath, something is always shifting, unseen, unheard, preparing. And when the ice finally cracks, it all floods forth at once, unstoppable, luminous, terrifying, beautiful. And as we sit here, thousands of miles apart yet gathered in this shared imagination, we realize that the same laws that shaped Snowball Earth shape us too, that the patience of deep time is alive in our blood, and maybe, just maybe, the purpose of remembering these ancient stories is not only to understand the planet but to understand ourselves, to realize that survival is not the same as stagnation, that stillness is not the same as death, that the coldest nights contain within them the seed of dawn. And so we breathe with the planet, we breathe with its ancient ice, and in that breath we feel both small and infinite, because if Earth can endure eons of silence only to awaken into brilliance, then surely we can endure the smaller winters of our own lives. And perhaps that is the truest lesson. Snowball Earth whispers through the ages. Be patient, for life is always waiting beneath the ice. And so we widen the lens, and in the mind's eye the frozen Earth takes shape, not as a dry diagram from a textbook but as a living, glittering marble adrift in the vast silence of space, wrapped in a shell of white that gleams beneath the pale light of a distant sun. The equator itself sealed in ice so thick that no wave moves, no tide breaks, no open sea stirs, and yet beneath that frozen ceiling the oceans still breathe, currents still move in slow, muffled circulation, and in that cold, hidden water, life clings on. Tiny microbes drifting like sparks in the abyss, feeding on faint trickles of nutrients, waiting, patient, as if they know the ice will not last forever. And above them the continents lie buried under glaciers that grind across their backs like enormous white beasts, carving valleys, crushing stone into powder that will one day feed forests and rivers, and here and there volcanoes pierce the frost, black mouths exhaling fire and ash against the endless white, staining it in streaks of shadow, creating little pockets of warmth where life gathers like travelers around a campfire in an infinite night. And the sky above is heavy with haze, sunlight scattering weakly, the Earth reflecting so much brilliance back into space that warmth is denied entry. And yet, in that glittering prison, the story does not end. It deepens, it hardens, it grows more improbable and therefore more miraculous, because to imagine a whole world locked in ice is to imagine despair. And yet the truth written in stone is that it was not despair but preparation. For every grinding glacier, every plume of volcanic ash, every faint current in the dark ocean was part of a hidden choreography leading to a moment when the ice would crack, when the atmosphere would fill with greenhouse gases, when the planet would shift from silence to explosion, and life would bloom with a richness never before seen. And to hold that vision is to realize that Earth itself has lived through extremes we can scarcely imagine, and that resilience is etched into its being, and by extension into ours. And maybe that is why this story feels so comforting even in its strangeness, because it tells us that cold seasons end, that even when everything looks locked and lifeless there are forces at work that cannot be stopped, forces building pressure, weaving possibility, waiting to erupt in color and sound and life again. And as you picture the snowball drifting through space, frozen yet alive, ask yourself, what parts of your own life are under ice right now? What dreams are hidden beneath glaciers of waiting? What possibilities lie dormant beneath the weight of silence? And can you trust that, like the Earth itself, they too are preparing for their thaw, and in that trust find patience, for even the deepest winter is only a passage, never the end. And so we drift deeper into this vision, and the scene becomes more vivid, more cinematic, as though we are orbiting the frozen Earth ourselves, watching the sunlight spill across its icy skin in a way that feels both beautiful and terrifying. Because instead of glittering blue oceans there are plains of glassy white stretching across the globe, cracked and ridged where glaciers have moved, their slow crawl carving scars into the continents beneath, and when the sun rises, its rays glance off. These frozen fields, scattering into the thin atmosphere, painting the horizon not with the warm glow of dawn but with a sharp, metallic shimmer, a light that blinds more than it warms, while above, the sky is strange, heavy with volcanic haze, streaked with pale ribbons of clouds carrying ice crystals that sparkle like powdered diamonds when they catch the sunlight. And here and there great volcanoes tear open the stillness, fountains of lava spilling across frozen plains, carving fiery rivers that steam against the cold, releasing gases that climb into the atmosphere, building slowly, invisibly, toward the day when the planet will finally begin to thaw, and in the oceans, beneath that sealed ceiling of ice, life survives in pockets of darkness, in hydrothermal vents where black plumes of heat rise from the seafloor like underworld chimneys. And in these hidden places microbes cluster, ancient and stubborn, inventing strategies to endure the long winter of the world. Some feeding on chemicals instead of sunlight, some forming tiny communities where the waste of one becomes the food of another, as if they too understood that survival is always collective, always shared, and above them, in the silence of the frozen seas, the pressure of time builds, millions of years slipping past in slow, icy breaths, until the planet's atmosphere grows thick with carbon dioxide, trapped by the ceaseless breathing of volcanoes, and eventually that blanket grows warm enough to challenge the frost, to begin melting the edges, to send rivulets of liquid water racing across the ice, cutting paths, seeding currents, softening a world that had once seemed immovable. And when the thaw finally comes, it is not gentle. It is cataclysmic, glaciers collapsing, oceans surging, storms roaring across continents that awaken from their slumber. And with that release comes a new Earth, a fertile Earth, one where life does not just return but explodes, diversifies, experiments with form and function in ways that will eventually lead, billions of years later, to us sitting here now wondering about that frozen past. And in this we see the most human truth of all. That what feels like stillness is never truly still, what feels like the end is only the quiet before transformation. And maybe that is why the story of Snowball Earth lingers in us, because we too live through seasons of ice, and we too carry the possibility of thaw, and perhaps the patience of those microbes and the endurance of those volcanoes are written into us, reminders that no winter, no silence, no pause lasts forever. And so as the ice begins to break and the thawing of the great snowball unfolds, the Earth that emerges is almost unrecognizable compared to the one that was buried beneath miles of ice for millions of years. Because when the glaciers retreat, they do not simply vanish. They grind and scrape the continents into fresh canvases, leaving behind valleys, basins, and plains dusted with mineral-rich sediments that pour into the oceans, and those sediments, pulverized by the slow violence of ice, carry nutrients that flood the seas in a way the world had never seen before, turning barren waters into blooming gardens, feeding algae, feeding microbes, feeding the fragile beginnings of ecosystems that will cascade upward into more complex life. And here is where the poetry of this planet takes center stage, because the same ice that seemed to suffocate the Earth also prepared the way for abundance. The same frost that once locked the oceans gave birth to the conditions that would make them teem with color, movement, and possibility. And when scientists trace this moment in deep time, they find that the thaw after Snowball Earth coincides with one of the most astonishing leaps in the history of life: the Cambrian explosion, a time when creatures of strange and wondrous design filled the seas, bodies with eyes and limbs and shells suddenly appearing in the fossil record, as